So welcome everybody to this panel dedicated to Bi plus Arts. It's a huge pleasure to chair the session. So I will give the floor in a moment to Kaylie Hatos, our first presenter. Kaylie recently completed her master's degree in art therapy and creativity. Sorry, my my document was all over the place. Creativity development at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. In her work as an art therapist, she hopes to help bi plus people, especially those in straight presenting relationships, explore and affirm their identity through art making. And as a fiber artist, she is particularly interested in researching how to utilize weaving as a therapeutic modality, which is incredibly fascinating for me as a fellow thread person. So kudos to weaving. Kaylie is presenting a speech titled From Binegativity to Identity Affirmation, exploring the bisexual woman identity through a heuristic self-study utilizing weaving. Kaylie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Let me know that you can see it. Everyone see? Yes? Okay, wonderful. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kaylie. Thanks for having me here today. I'm here to present my self-study about bisexual identity affirmation. I am a recent art therapy graduate and used my thesis as an opportunity to explore my bisexual identity before I embark on my journey as a queer art therapist. I felt it was really important as a therapist to do this deep self-reflection before working with LGBTQIA+ clients. So I used weaving as an art modality because of its generative and expressive nature. And you can see the 4 weavings that I created here behind my long title. And I'll show them again later. So the research questions that I wanted to ask is, what can the art therapy technique of weaving symbolize identity affirmation for bisexual women? What is the role and impact of making the bisexual identity visible through art making? And I think a lot of you probably are familiar with minority stress and have experienced it, but just a few things to keep in mind about why bi plus people might want to use art therapy as a way to reflect and process their identity. Here's just a few research-backed statements. Sexual minority women experience more mood and anxiety disorders, suicidal ideation and behavior, substance dependence, than by heterosexual women. And bi plus women in particular have highest levels of shame in particular, or in more levels of shame than their lesbian counterparts, which puts them on higher risk. And bi plus people are often not believed when they come out, and they're told it's just a phase. And this is messaging coming from both the straight and gay and lesbian communities. And then there's the stereotypes of bi plus people being hypersexual, non-monogamous, and untrustworthy. And this can result in relationship problems, self-stigma, and sexual violence from partners. And then there's identity denial coming both from other people and self-denial. And a lot of people have mentioned this in other presentations, but a lot of bi plus people experience being presumed straight or gay or lesbian, and that is due to the partner or partners that they currently have. And this bi plus erasure contributes to feelings of confusion, rejection, isolation, and internalized biphobia. Give me one moment. Okay. All right, and so the next slide, can everyone see this? Okay. So talking a little bit about the bisexual identity inventory that I used for my self-study, I used this 24-item assessment to measure 4 different factors. And these 4 factors are illegitimacy of bisexuality, internalized, which is an internalization of the stereotype that bi plus identities are not legitimate. Factor 2 is internalized binegativity, which is negative feelings towards one's bisexual identity. And factor 3 is fears of, anticipated binegativity, which is fears of being treated poorly by others because of identity. And finally, we have identity affirmation, which is what we're striving for, pride in one's bi plus identity. And I used heuristic research to do my study, and just a little bit about the rundown. I'm not going to go through all of this, but the important thing to know about heuristic research is that you act as researcher and participant. And I want to talk primarily about the immersion process, which was when I created my weavings using the art therapy open studio method. And I created 4 weavings over the course of 5 weeks, and each weaving was based on the 4 factors that I just described in the last slide. And I completed the bisexual identity, let me just show that again, the bisexual identity inventory assessment before I started each weaving and after I finished each weaving to track my progress. And in addition to this, I also reflected in journaling before and after each weaving session for 10 minutes, reflecting on how I felt about that week's factor and the weaving I was working on. All right, so a little bit about results. So here are the 4 weavings that I created. And just to give you an idea of how large they are, the longest one was about 6 feet long. So taller than me, I'm 4'11". From left to right, you can see the 4 factors: illegitimacy of bisexuality, anticipated binegativity, internalized binegativity, and identity affirmation. And I'll briefly discuss artistic choices about them in a moment. But before I do that, I'll talk about the 2 concepts that came up in this research. Under the binegativity concept, I found themes of confusion, inconvenience, vulnerability, unworthiness, and judgment. And under the concept of identity affirmation, I found the themes of comfort, validation, being seen, and freedom. And the trends I observed in the assessment data that I gained from the inventory that I mentioned is my feelings of bisexuality as a legitimate sexual identity remained unchanged. My self-consciousness about speaking about my bisexuality decreased. I reported significantly less self-stigma than I started with, and my willingness to celebrate and identify with my bisexuality increased as I worked on the 4 weavings. And we'll look at the weavings a little bit more and close up. And just a really brief analysis, I wrote many pages about this, but I'll keep it brief, is I noticed that so starting from the left, I noticed that in my illegitimacy of bisexuality weaving, it had a very natural look that was almost moss-like, which contributed to this feeling that I do believe it's natural and something innate. In my anticipated binegativity weaving, I utilized an overlocking technique that was physically draining and brought to mind the push and pull that I feel when trying to decide if I want to come out again and again as a woman in a straight presenting relationship. And the third one, which was definitely the moodiest, was my internalized binegativity. And it was the longest one I had made at that point. It was very dark and moody. However, at the end of the weaving, it was very cathartic to kind of externalize that internalized feeling. I was able to add some color to these really dark emotions that I had just processed in that time. And finally, the last weaving was my identity affirmation weaving. And this one was the most consistent and light and soft weaving that I created. And for the first time after finishing a weaving, I had this intense inclination to wrap myself in the weaving and actually left the studio with it around my neck as a scarf. It was actually a very cold day, so it worked out quite well. And so in conclusion, Over the course of these 5 weeks, I investigated my thoughts, my experiences, and feelings as I drew metaphors from the weavings I created. I found that weaving is a successful modality for bisexual identity affirmation because the act of weaving cloth gave me the benefit of feeling seen and feeling free to express myself, both of which I identified as important aspects of identity affirmation. And looking forward, before I end, I would be remiss to not reiterate that there are countless ways to be bi plus, and this is only one story. I'm a cisgender white woman who has had the time and resources, was in a grad program for art therapy, and so I had the opportunity to reflect deeply on my identity and use art making as a modality. This is obviously not the case for everyone. And I would love to eventually adapt and recreate this study with a larger population of multisexual people of different genders, ages, backgrounds, and relationship dynamics. So thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate being able to share my thesis work with everyone. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. This is my email. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you, Kaylie. I would love to take part in any kind of workshop, anything that you would like.
Thank you.
I loved everything about it. Okay, so and I see some appreciation in the chat. So I didn't say it before, but we're gonna do all the presentations and then we're gonna leave the final moments for questions so we don't interrupt the flow. So now it's time for our second speaker, Soraya Cipolla. Soraya Cipolla is a PhD candidate in Italian Studies and Queer Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign. Her research focuses on sapphic desire in 20th and 21st Italian literature and cinema. She's also a proud community activist, and over the years, she has worked to advocate for workers' rights, reproductive justice, and LGBTQ people rights in Italy and in the USA, and don't we need that in this moment? So thank you, Soraya. She's presenting a speech, and the title is, Does the term sapphic make bisexuality among women more visible? Soraya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucia. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Share. Hold on. Share options. Hold on a second. I think my Zoom in the US is different than this one for some reason. Let's see.
Your...
yeah, hold on. I figured. I think I found the option. Yes.
Don't worry, it's been...
Yes. 1 second. Presenting on Zoom is kind of new in a way, and all at the same time. So here we are. I show. Okay. Okay.
Yes, all good.
We got it. Yes. Okay. Here we go. Thank you so much, Lucia, and thank you for bearing with me in this second where I needed to figure out Zoom again. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of my research and how I use the term sapphic. So in this talk, I will overview the use of this term within LGBTQ plus scholarship and how I use sapphic in my work to make bisexuality and gender variance visible. A little bit about my research. It focuses on 20th and 21st century narratives of women's same-sex desire in Italian literature and cinema. I argue that sapphic desire, as I call it, produces ghostly characters and narrations. These characters on Italian culture In contemporary terms, we can define the subject of my work as lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, and other sapphic-related sexual orientations. However, most of these historical and fictional characters never use any labels for themselves. Furthermore, the characters and historical figures I engage with question their gender identity and relationship with womanhood. The problems of labels we were discussing during the keynote is always in my mind as a scholar. Using the term sapphic desire allows me to consider the various experiences I investigate in my work, connecting them to a genealogy of women's same-sex desire that can relate to the poet Sappho. In this way, I can use the narration to deepen our contemporary understanding of gender identity and sexual orientation and avoid making bisexuality invisible as often happens. Sapphic also helps me to connect with contemporary queer activists. This term is being explored by activists both in Anglophone countries and in Italy. I am bringing here the example of Memini Saffici, Little Sapphic Memes. This Facebook and Instagram meme page uses Sapphic to dissociate with trans-exclusionary feminism in Italy, in particular to Archilesbica. In the US, Sapphic is quite popular within activist communities. I'm going to quote Yasmin Amu, a queer activist based in Philadelphia, who talking about using Sapphic for herself, says, quote, "I love identifying as a Sapphic woman because for one, it sounds fancy AF. For another, the derivative of the word is as poetic as my love for femme can be. There have been points in my life where I have felt more comfortable identifying as bisexual, while at other times I have preferred lesbian. Regardless of the label, it is my Sapphic love that has remained constant." Yasmin Amu refers to the instability of labels and how she sometimes likes to use lesbian and sometimes bisexual, while Sapphic feels right. She stresses the poetic meaning of women's attraction and accounts for labels' instability. I would like to incorporate some of these activist reflections into my work, destabilizing womanhood and making clear my support to trans people. In my work, I engage with different scholars, and I do not always completely subscribe to their arguments, especially when they use lesbian as an umbrella term. Terry Castle is a fundamental scholar in my work. However, I do not completely support her approach. In The Apparition of Lesbian, she argues that lesbians, which in her work include bi+ people, women in this case, are ghosted through the dismissal of their experience. I agree. However, I do not believe that deconstructing the term lesbian contributes to this invisibilization process, as she argues. I understand that generating instability within the terminology might be detrimental to the goal of creating the spotlight. However, I believe that imposing a fixed label can harm as well, as it can create a fixed imaginary of gender and sexual orientation that can affect people who do not want to identify with that specific label and feel excluded. Another important voice for my work is Robin Hackett. She coined the term sapphic primitivism to connect the study of same-sex desire with race and class. She defined it as, quote, "a mode of writing in which figurations of Blackness and working class culture appear as constitutive element of white-authored fictional representation of female sexual autonomy, including homoerotic," unquote. My work resonates with sapphic primitivism. In analyzing ghosts of sapphic existence within Italian literature and cinema, I also investigate race and class. While Hackett theorized the existence of sapphic primitivism within different literary works, she begins her reflection how she uses lesbian as a label for women's same-sex desire. In her words, quote, "I often use the word lesbian, although it sometimes feels impossible to do so in light of discursive theories of homosexuality. Erotic between women may be more precise, but is too clunky to be practical for consistent use. It also points to the fluidity of categories of sexuality at the cost of solidifying the term woman, which is itself unstable," unquote. Another interesting aspect of the use of sapphic is how it highlights the use of strict labels within the lesbian community. Laura Donn and Jane Garrity, in their preface of Sapphic Modernities, argue for the use of sapphic as it distances us from the more rigid contemporary categories of identity, such as butch or femme, and reminds us the claiming of sexual identity Indeed, the exclusive connection of Sappho with same-sex desire is relatively recent, unquote. So I want to add this understanding of labels as not fixed in my work, which is mostly literary and cinematic. So I also refer to Lisa L. Moore and her work in Dangerous Intimacy, which link my work to the sapphic scholarship on homoeroticism, which I encounter in my work. She argues that 18th century English novel not only shaped the self-understanding of the bourgeoisie, but also their sexuality. In the context of same-sex desire among women, it distinguished between different kinds of homosexuality. Quote, female homosocial spaces operate a guarantee of English moral purity. Hence, the category of female friendship is the principal syntax through which the complicated grammar of gender, sexuality, race, and nation is parsed, unquote. In my work, I encounter often homosocial experiences, and using sapphic helps me to give a label that is not as strict as it can be talking about bi+ or lesbians. So the big question is, how can we talk about bisexuality within history and fiction? While considering these past approaches to literary works and historical events and characters, I strive to respect people from the past and their work, but I need to find ways to engage with their narratives and learn about our genealogy and history. This genealogy includes both lesbian and bisexual women. I will give some examples from my work to show how using sapphic helps make womanhood a more loose and then inclusive terms, and how using sapphic helps make women's bisexuality more visible. In my work, many characters and writers problematize their relationship with womanhood, sexual desire, and conventional relationship. For example, Sibilla Leramo, an Italian feminist writer, could be seen as bisexual, although she will never use this term. She was in love with another writer, Lina Poletti, while she was also involved with Giovanni Cena, a poet. In my analysis of the love letters between Lina and Sibilla, I consider how Aleramo never clearly identified a sexual orientation and does not seem to have felt drawn to do it in the same way that a 2024 author might. At the same time, although Aleramo never uses this term, her experience and thoughts connect to what we might today call bisexuality and polyamory. Sapphic as a term allows me to connect my contemporary interpretation to Aleramo's experience without trying to reduce one to the other. Furthermore, I use sapphic as a kind of activism to draw attention to the way that Aleramo is packaged and edited for contemporary readers, and the way such mediation brings in biases that may not be in Aleramo's. The love letter exchange between Lina and Sibilla were edited by Alessandra Cenni in 1982 and republished in 2023. Cenni's edited collection, last edition, referenced trans-exclusionary feminism. Using sapphic in this context helped me re-examine Aleramo while confronting Cenni trans-exclusionary feminists and engage Aleramo from within my transfeminist scholarship. Another example I would like to give is the case of Goliarda Sapienza. Sapienza's character Joyce from The Art of Joy does not always identify with womanhood. Using the term sapphic helps me to acknowledge the complexity of gender and sexuality and the instability of gender categories and sexual orientations. Through the character Joyce, Sapienza voices a painful gender exploration and refusal of womanhood. I'm not a woman, I'm a deviant being, she says. Furthermore, Modesta, the main character, has a relationship with both women and men. She can be defined as bisexual in our understanding of sexual orientation, and again, she does not use the term for herself. Through the use of sapphic, I can move through this complex representation of gender and sexual orientation with my understanding of gender and sexual orientation. My work also connects to the legacy of scholarship that understands sexual orientation and gender identity intersectionally, while considering as well different forms of oppression, including racialized capitalism. For example, in approaching Ijaba Shego, a contemporary Black Italian writer, I look at how she analyzes whiteness and class struggle within her work. Reading Shego's work through an intersectional lens allows my work to connect with a genealogy scholarship on sapphic desire while deepening the understanding of race in Italy. Two of her novels, Beyond Babylon and Rhoda, are important sites to explore both gender identity and sexual orientation in connection to race and socioeconomic background. For example, Mar, a character from Beyond Babylon, could be defined as bisexual in our understanding of sexual orientation. However, she does not use any label for herself. Same for Rhoda, the protagonist of the homonymous novel, who could be referred to as lesbian in our understanding of sexual orientation, but does not accept this label for herself. This refusal is also part of the character's intense internalized homophobia. Using sapphic allows me to have a lens to investigate these contemporary narratives that do not use LGBTQ+ identities while engaging with this narration to explore the history of these labels within Italian culture. In my work, I intend to collaborate with people from the past and share awareness on how we can read them to engage with the contemporary LGBTQ+ struggle. These and other characters within my research expand our understanding of gender identity and sexual orientation within a society that tends to encapsulate queer people with sometimes strict labels, both inside and outside the LGBTQ+ community. Using sapphic allows me to show different sexual orientations and contribute to the history and genealogy of bisexuality among women and non-binary people. This approach serves the fight against different oppressive forces we face in the present as part of the LGBTQ+ community. Thank you.
Thank you, Soraya. Sorry, my Zoom refused to unmute. Thank you so much. Also, kudos to Memini Lesbici, one of the Memini Saffici, one of the best memes places in Italy. But we can discuss it later. So now it's time for our third presenter, Camila Neira. Thank you for joining us and defeat the Zoom gods that try to put an obstacle over your path. So let me share your bio. Camila has a master in international relations with a focus on research in digital media representation, diversity, and inclusion. She received an excellent master's thesis award for her dissertation on media, popular culture, and social media images of female bisexuality in Japan, and how self-representations of Japanese LGBT+ women content creators are visually negotiated, particularly on YouTube. She graduated in Languages and Social Cultural Studies and Literature from the Universidad de los Andes, Colombia, and focused her undergraduate thesis on the analysis of visual representations of femininity that confront female stereotypes in well-known Japanese pop culture works such as Sailor Moon and Sakura Card Captor. And today she presents a contribution titled Images of Bisexual Women in Japan, Mainstream Media, YouTube, and Scholarly Discourse. Camila, the floor is yours.
Lucia, thank you very much. As you said, I finally defeated the Zoom gods. And I'm very glad to be able to join you guys here today. I don't know if you can see my screen properly.
Yes.
Please let me know. Thank you very much. So as you said, thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. I'm going to share with you a little bit about my findings in my MA research, especially around images of bisexual women and bisexual female characters in Japan. I think Japan is a very interesting case study for this kind of research approaches, because although it's one of the longest recorded homosexual and non-heterosexual academic and also artistic records that we have in the world, Japan is also a country where LGBTQ rights are not protected under law. They are not outright banned as they are in some other countries in the world. But this kind of tension coexists between how they are represented in pop culture, in celebrity aspects, and how people, like regular people, live their lives in Japan as LGBTQ people, and of course as bisexual women. My focus on bisexual women started with a presentation. You can hear me? Okay. My focus on this topic started with the news that came, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, about a Japanese idol that decided to come out as a bisexual woman, and she received so much backlash on her social media and her personal life that she decided to retire from the industry entirely. So I want to kind of approach what are the images that were negotiated within mainstream media and how bisexual women in their life decide to present themselves or not present themselves as bisexual women. But when I started with this research, I found out that there's very little academic research on the topic. So I needed to kind of take a step back and understand how can we approach a country as Japan in terms of bisexual women and their images on the media before starting talking about social media. So I don't know if you guys are avid consumers of Japanese popular culture, but it has a lot of non-heterosexual female characters presented in very wide range amount of words. And I think some of them can be perceived by the audience as bisexual or bisexual presenting, even though they are not outright spoken as bisexual characters. Some of them are take into the male role and they're more male presenting and they assert dominance as male characters and they are coded as male within their own narratives, but they express their desire through women. I mean, they express their desire as women, they date women, and some of them are openly in female, maybe we could say sapphic relationships. But within this very long-standing and very long history of pop culture representation of non-heterosexual female characters, we find that there is kind of a tension on how can we present female desire. Why do we have to adhere to male presenting protagonists or male presenting characters to kind of explore this female desire without kind of branching out into different perspectives and representations of female and female sexuality. And in mainstream media, we have a similar tension, I would say, with classical theater like Takarazuka, where they're only employed female actresses that take into both male and female roles, and also celebrities who openly express their sexuality, but that they are not frowned upon as they are their sexual desire is presented as part of their character. So I think on one hand, we have this very explicit, we could say, presentation of female sexuality on pop culture, on mainstream media, on kind of the celebrity realm and the arts. And on the other hand, very recently, I would say also with a big boom from the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, Japan has tried very forcefully and very strategically to present itself as a very progressive and LGBT friendly country, even with like state mandates and kind of education campaigns for its own population to put to the forefront LGBTQ topics where they were never discussed before. So for example, I have here some books, they're like textbook style books that people can find on bookstores about what are LGBTQ people, what does the acronym stand for, can we quote unquote identify them amongst us. And also here within this kind of effort, state effort to present LGBTQ topics, we have also bisexual people kind of coming to the forefront with this, I don't know if you can see a pointer, but there are some bisexual women who have published their own books with their own perspectives on what is to be a bisexual woman in Japan. So I think it's very interesting how in this kind of broad scenario, we have different points through which mainstream society that we can assume it's very heteronormative and straight, desiring in a way, approaching images of bisexual women. So with this groundwork laid in my research, I wanted to understand how female content creators express their own bisexuality, which images are they taking, and what kind of are the negotiations they have to go through in order to present themselves or not as bisexual women. So through all this kind of groundwork, I found different archetypes, you could call them, of how bisexual women are presented in mainstream media. One would be Bishoujo, which would be the beautiful woman, the kind of the like a femme archetype, we could say, kind of an homologous. Then the Ikemen Joshi, or the more butch kind of image of a woman that is still very beautiful, but it's more like male leaning. And the one that I found most interesting is the Tojisha, or the representative. This comes from Mark McClelland's approach on the LGBT community as a whole in Japan. And his research focused on how some people are designated as representatives, and they speak for their community, and they are seen as kind of this beacon of how this whole community should be understood and represented. And these Tojisha images are very curated, but also very desired in some characteristics. So, for example, when you have this very stereotypical Japanese woman who just happens to be bisexual, but she has a very respectable job. She presents as a very traditional kind of Japanese woman, but she happens to be bisexual. This Tojisha image is very useful for mainstream discourse to kind of negotiate that her gender presentation and her gender role is very adapted, quote unquote, to Japanese society, but her sexuality can almost be overlooked as just kind of a note, a footnote on how she presents to the world. And with this lens, I chose through kind of a selection process in my data collection, 2 channels that kind of take the opposite approach on how they present their bisexuality as women. This one you see on your left is called Urban TV. This is a very popular channel, you could say. It has, I think, almost 2,000 followers at the moment. And the couple that runs it, they kind of share maybe a double layer life, you could say, as influencers, because they have a very long running channel where they present very explicitly their relationship with one another. And they also own a rental company, like a house rental company that specializes on LGBTQ friendly rentals for people. And they're very well known in both regards and very public figures, as well as they were allowed, quote unquote, allowed to get married and have an adopted kid within their ward. So in Japan, it's not horizontally legalized to be married as a same-sex couple. You can choose different wards within certain cities to get married. So they were granted their wards permission to get married, you could say. So in their channel, their expression visually is very reminiscent of like shoujo images, very close, very affectionate, more towards this kind of literature or manga or anime for women. And where this exploration of female desire is more kind of tender, tending towards being very sexualized by the audience, and it's kind of catered to kind of bring up to the top of mind of the audience this kind of yuri and almost also very sexual images in some of their content. Of course, some of their content is more like their daily life and how they reflect upon the struggles of being a same-sex couple in Japan and their life, and just like kind of different avenues. But the most seen videos of their channel are very, very forefront on displaying sexual affection towards one another. And on the other hand, we have a channel called Polygons, which does not comprise only around sexuality in general, but it touches on, you could say, key subjects to Japanese society. So we have it talks about religion, we have talks about immigration, and our Dorisha, our representative here, is speaking about her expression and her realization of being a bisexual woman in Japan, and how she thinks she can educate, quote unquote, the general public on what her being bisexual means in the Japanese context. So in my research, I discussed the kind of difference between being represented. That representation could be defined as the practice of the meaning of a visual message encoded, created, and deciphered by an audience. How these images are different from self-representation that could be seen as a more conscious, mediated representation of the self, created in social media and produced to have interaction with the audience. And I have found that a lot of these tropes kind of come and be re-signified. And they're used, I believe, to cater to a certain audience, to have kind of their focus be on specific points, on specific parts of an image, instead of, we could say, instead of having like real, actual activism and just like political advancement of kind of the understanding of sexuality and different sexualities that differ from a heteronormative space. But I am always very conflicted about that understanding of this, especially from my perspective, because the mainstream discourses that I've found kind of align a little bit, almost shockingly to me, with some of the things I have experienced as a bisexual woman in my country, Colombia, that is very different region from Japan. But also in doing all this like kind of investigation, I had to keep reminding myself that it's not possible for us to come to a consensus of what bisexuality is in academic research, and not even how do we understand sexual preference or sexual identity even. And I kind of keep harping on this point because in a lot of bisexual or just LGBTQ scholarship in Japan even, the idea of having a sexual identity is not the baseline, and it's not the kind of goal people are striving against or striving towards. Sexuality is sort of, by some scholars, as just part of like behavior. It's not a very concrete part of your identity that you can kind of create and strive to be a certain way. That I think, especially in earlier research that I've read, is one of the main points of contention between different scholars around this topic, because when you understand sexual expression as just a part of what people do and not what people are as their intrinsic identity, it is very difficult to do something as activism, sort of in a very Western term, of striving towards policy, of doing all this community work to better a community's understanding, because you cannot pinpoint exactly a very set characteristic of what this being this kind of label means. And I was kind of thinking about what I was talking about, that having very strict categories makes academic discourse around bisexuality and female bisexuality, I would say, very difficult to access, because you cannot, in my opinion, you cannot try and grasp characteristics and just make them fit in what you think what bisexuality means and how bisexuality looks. So kind of in this tension between how is it understood bisexuality as just part of what you do and how your behavior is in a lot of terms of sexual fluidity and impermanence, and how a lot of scholarship coming from like the US and the UK adapted to the Japanese context can be seen as more striving towards static and continuous traits, and how do we create a community that strives for a specific representation of bisexual people and how that image would look. I honestly ended up my research without kind of a bigger conclusion on this, but what I want to bring here is a little bit of this broad spectrum panorama that I would love to continue exploring on how pop culture and mainstream media and this state pushed idea of LGBTQ representation and activism plays into how people in their daily lives and how micro celebrities as influencers in Japan express their own sexuality and what images are being dealt with within this very taken from like 60s and 70s female literature such as shoujo images, and how these more contemporary ideas are being dealt with and analyzed and maybe resignified within this context. So, yeah, that's very briefly.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you so much also for this super cute slide. So it's now time for our last but not least speaker, who is joining us from Sydney. So it's the middle of the night for him. So thank you so much, Kim, for joining the panel today. So Dr. Kim Kemmis has a PhD in history at the University of Sydney. His research interests include oral history and the history of bisexuality, especially the lived experience of bisexual people and the ways in which they saw themselves. And today he's presenting Loving Them Both, Colin McInnes, and the Complexity of Bisexuality. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Good morning, everyone. I'll just try and get this up on the screen. And of course, it's not going to work.
It's mostly working. You just have to
Mostly working, yeah.
present to
Yeah.
click. Yeah.
Okay, great. We're here. In the early 1970s, bisexuality arrived in Western popular culture. David Bowie came out as bi in Melody Maker, and movies like Sunday Bloody Sunday and Cabaret made it possible for people to talk openly about bisexuality without seeming sleazy. In response to this discussion, the English writer Colin McInnes wrote a small book called Loving Them Both, a study of bisexuality and bisexuals that appears to be the first significant work by a bisexual writer about bisexual experience. Now, during his lifetime, McInnes was renowned as a critic on radio, television, and in print. He presented intelligent and incisive and often very funny examinations of a wide variety of subjects such as art, literature, theatre, politics, sport, racism, censorship. He wrote about everything. He advocated for the civil rights of homosexual people and people of colour, although his relations with both were full of contradictions. As a person, he could be enormously generous and unbelievably horrible. And I think I would have liked to have known him, but I'm not sure I would have enjoyed it. He's most well known today for his 3 novels, the London novels, called City of Spades, Absolute Beginners, and Mr. Love and Justice, which discuss the life of young people, cops and criminals, and immigrants to the UK in the late 1950s. I recommend you look them up. Absolute Beginners was made into a not very good film in the 1980s, but it starred David Bowie and had some really good music, so it's worth a look. Now, Colin McInnes was well qualified to write about bisexuality because he was openly bisexual. He enjoyed relationships and encounters with men and women from his 20s onwards. The 2 most significant attachments in his life were a long-standing different-sex affair with the Belgian painter Mahu Isonton and an unrequited love for a heterosexual Nigerian man named Ricky Horton, who shared his flat for a few months in 1952. At times, his sexuality made him conflicted and indecisive. He once wrote, "I am the donkey who hesitated between two thistles and died of starvation." While he occasionally slept with women after his affair with Israelton, from the early 1950s he settled into a pattern of encounters with men, mostly black, in relations that were casual and commercial but never permanent. Now, Loving Them Both is a short book, 55 pages, with a fairly loose structure. I'll give you a very brief outline. He describes the ways in which bisexual people relate to others, how they relate to men and to women, whether those men and women are heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual. He discusses how bisexual people have sex, presents a geographical and literary survey of bisexuality, and concludes with a call for a new view of bisexuality. But he begins with what he calls an attempted definition. A bisexual of either sex is one who is equally attracted by individuals of both sexes, as well, of course, as equally repelled by others. The degree of this attraction may vary, and I think usually does. There are probably few bisexuals whose love affairs have been mathematically divided as between both sexes, either in the number of persons or performances. This is a bit more nuanced than definitions of the time. This is 1973 when he was writing. It reflects the contemporary binary view of bisexuality, which is now outdated, but he adds complexity by saying how the degree of attraction may vary. Now, this was a fundamental feature of the Kinsey scale, but in the 1970s, most people didn't realise that. Now, while McInnes's stated intention is to describe bisexuality in general, he focuses on male bisexuality. His descriptions of male sexuality are very brief and reductive. He views women's sexuality only as it relates to men, and this is by far the greatest weakness of the book. In his eyes, having been with women makes the bisexual man more attractive to homosexual men. His heterosexual experience reinforces his masculinity and makes him better in bed. But that experience with women also influences his relations with straight men. He understands that the heterosexual man's feelings towards women, he understands the man's feelings towards women and realizes that that places a boundary on his relations with him, so is less likely to flirt with him and more likely to flirt with homosexual men. And the bisexual man faces other barriers in connecting with other men. Even if he does flirt with a straight man, that man may not notice him because the bisexual man's speech and conduct look exactly the same as his own. And he has a similar problem with how the gay man might see him. When it comes to the bisexual's relationship with homosexual males, these last may often, despite their highly developed instinct for spotting sexual deviance, make two mistakes about him. If he overtly declares himself by speech or conduct to be one of themselves, they may erroneously conclude that he is exclusively so. If, on the other hand, he appears before them in his heterosexual context, for instance, heavily involved with a woman, they may equally falsely assume that he is entirely straight and that there's nothing doing. From all this, one can see that the bisexual, in both the heterosexual and homosexual worlds, can be at moments something of an invisible man. And this is something that rings true 50 years later. But when two men finally get together, he says, it's better than being with a woman. Firstly, there's a lower risk of emotional involvement. Relations between men and women, he thinks, no matter how apparently casual, are inevitably a serious matter because it's impossible for men and women to make love without forming a deeper emotional connection. Secondly, there's no risk of procreation, a constant possibility in different sex relationships. I'm not really impressed with his view of female sexuality there. And the implied precedence of male ways extends to sexual acts in ways which I won't actually go into at the moment. On a positive side, McInnes also talks about the experiences of women married to bisexual men. He notes a surprisingly large number of cases where the heterosexual woman is unaware of her bisexual man's real nature. It may be ignorance or denial, but he points out that an authentic bisexual's attachment to a woman is absolutely genuine, which gives his sexuality the same kind of invisibility he has in other relationships. He also comments with a great deal of sensitivity on how women in these situations might react. He expressed the belief in some of his other writings that bisexuality is more extensive than most people think, and that it's far more widespread than homosexuality, something we now find confirmed in so many polls and studies, which is why perhaps he says at the end of the book, "I do not regard bisexuals as abnormal, chiefly because most of those I know, both men and women, seem to me balanced and healthy people. In fact, bisexuality is the ultimate norm. If a person has never felt sensually towards or had sex with a person of the same sex, then they are abnormal." Now, Loving Them Both is a flawed book because McInnes was an essayist, not a scientist. It's not an empirical examination. His terminology is very sloppy, and it exposes his sexism and his racism. And his politics are pretty much pre-Stonewall, post-Wolfenden, very much centered in the United Kingdom. And of course, he only focuses on men. But the book offers something original. It's a subtle and complex account of the lived experience of male bisexuality at a time when attitudes to sexual identity and expression were changing. He distinguished bisexuality as a phenomenon apart from gay and lesbian identity. His comments on bi-invisibility still resonate, and his suppositions about the extent of bisexuality are now being found true. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kim. I tend to, after listening to your presentation, I agree with you that I would have probably find interesting this person, but finding him lovely, I'm not so sure. So thank you to all the speakers. This was an amazing panel. I learned so much.